Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is part of our Mass General Cancer Center Genetics Series, which is a special collaboration between the Blum Center and Mass General Cancer Center. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you may visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that everyone is in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speaker today. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, you may use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff and our guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. And lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to take. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. Okay, so next, I would like to introduce you all to our guest speaker, Carly Grant. Carly is a senior genetic counselor at the Mass General Cancer Center who works with both adults and children at risk for hereditary cancer syndromes. Prior to joining the MGH team in 2015, she worked at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in the Jimmy Fund. She enjoys teaching about genetics and giving talks to a variety of audiences. She joins us today to give a presentation on talking to kids about hereditary cancer. So please join me in welcoming Carly.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to share my screen now and pull up my slides. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic. It's one that I think about a lot and have a real interest in. I love the kind of psychosocial part of what I do as a genetic counselor. So I wanted to start by just giving you a framework of what I plan to cover in today's talk. Got to sort of start with a little bit of background, which you may have heard if you've heard any of these other talks. We cover this topic a lot, but just the differences between what we call hereditary versus sporadic cancer. And then talking a little bit about the difference between hereditary cancer syndromes that really are associated with adult-only cancer risks versus those that also include childhood cancer risks. We'll also cover some of the benefits and then potential harms of discussing hereditary cancer with children. And I'll go over a model for how and kind of when to discuss hereditary cancer syndrome with children of different ages and stages. And then just some tips on discussing this with children, and then we'll finish there. So it shouldn't be a super long talk today, plenty of time for questions at the end. So you may know this already, but if not, a lot of my patients always find this super surprising that really only a minority of cancer is hereditary. As you can see from that piece of the pie, it's just 5 to 10%. Most of the time when people develop cancer, it is what we call sporadic, which means it is caused by a combination of factors that include just kind of chance, the natural aging process, environmental factors. But when we talk about hereditary cancer, we're specifically talking about cancer that occurs because of a genetic mutation that's been identified in a family that can be passed down from one generation to the next in that family, causing those who inherit it to have an increased chance of developing certain types of cancer. So for the purposes of this talk today, that small piece of the pie is really what I am focused on, is hereditary cancer, or which we oftentimes refer to as a cancer syndrome. So I wanted to give a couple of case examples to start off with. We can't talk about genetics without putting a couple family trees up there, which we call pedigrees. And just to give you a quick background on pedigrees, if you don't already know this, We typically, or I should say traditionally, represent females with circles and males with squares, although we also have a diamond that can be used for if it's unknown or maybe non-binary. This whole thing is evolving, as you can imagine. It's not very inclusive at the moment with just having this sort of semi-binary system of representing gender, since we know there's so many different ways that people can identify. But for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to mainly have circles and squares. Okay, so in this family tree, just to kind of walk you through it, you can see that in the lowest level, or kind of the youngest generation there's two females. One had ovarian and one had colon cancer. And then a generation above, we've got an individual who had colon cancer and another individual who had both colon and uterine cancer. And then in the third generation above, you see another colon cancer. So you're seeing kind of three generations of colon cancers that are sort of diagnosed at younger ages, as well as an ovarian and a uterine cancer. And this is kind of really a very classic example of a syndrome called Lynch syndrome, or hereditary cancer syndrome, which is called Lynch syndrome. And Lynch syndrome, just to give you a quick background, occurs when someone is born with a mutation in one of 5 different genes. And we call it a germline mutation because that means it can be passed on from one generation to the next. Most cancer predisposition syndromes are passed down in the same kind of pattern of inheritance, which is called autosomal dominant, meaning that there's a 50% chance of passing it along from one generation to the next. And we know that individuals with Lynch syndrome are at increased risk for certain cancers, with, I guess, the big one being primarily colon cancer, but also uterine cancer and ovarian cancer in females, as well as other gastrointestinal cancers. I'm not going to be including a huge amount of detail in medical management because it's not really relevant to this talk today. But just wanted to mention, well, quickly, that first of all, that in the general population, the average age of colon cancer is in the late 60s and 70s. But for people with Lynch syndrome, it's a little bit younger, in the 40 to 60 age range. And medical management does include annual colonoscopy screening that could start as young as in the 20s, possibly upper endoscopies for those other GI cancers. Women may consider having ovaries and their uterus removed after childbearing, if that's what they choose to do, just because we don't have good screening for ovarian and uterine cancers. But take note that all of this medical management starts in adulthood. And that's because the cancer risks in Lynch syndrome are adult onset. Of course, there are sometimes exceptions where we will see children in some of these families, and it's very, very few and far between, but for the most part, this is an adult onset cancer syndrome. And so genetic testing really is not recommended for minors, for children, because it won't affect their medical management. And testing them deprives them of what's called a right to an open future, which basically means that you're taking away their opportunity to make their own decision about genetic testing as an adult. So this is kind of an agreed upon way of thinking about testing. So we're not going to be focusing on who should or shouldn't be tested in this talk, but I just wanted to kind of make that point. So Lynch syndrome is just one example of a hereditary cancer syndrome that's really adult-only cancer risks. There are many others as well. You may be familiar, for example, with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, which is caused by mutations in the BRCA1 and 2 genes. That's another adult-onset hereditary cancer syndrome, and there's many others. So this is just kind of one example of that. Let's look at another different type of example of a hereditary cancer syndrome. And again, just to walk you through this pedigree here, you might notice that we have a variety of different cancers that have affected these family members, including childhood cancers, right? There's a 18-year-old who was diagnosed with medulloblastoma at age 8. which is a brain cancer. There's a couple of individuals in the generation above that had adult onset cancers, but at really young ages. And then a generation above that, you see another childhood cancer. There's a leukemia up there, individual with a very young breast cancer and a leukemia. So you're kind of seeing 3 generations of cancers, some at very young ages, including childhood cancers. You're seeing breast cancer, sarcomas, leukemias, brain tumors, a variety of things. And this is, again, kind of a really classic example of a relatively rare hereditary cancer syndrome, which is called Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And that is a complicated name. It's just based on the 2 people who kind of discovered the families with, or I guess, characterize the syndrome, I should say. And Li-Fraumeni syndrome occurs when somebody is born with a germline mutation in a gene called TP53. It's autosomal dominant, just like Lynch syndrome was, 50% chance of passing it along from one generation to the next. But like I was kind of alluding to, in this case, having a TP53 mutation that a person is born with actually puts them at increased risk for one or more than one cancers that can occur really any time in life, including starting potentially at very young ages. And so we see things like sarcomas, breast cancers, brain tumors, leukemias, adrenal cortical cancer. Those are just some of the kind of core cancers. And because of those cancer risks and the ages that they can occur at in these families, medical management starts in childhood. And again, this is not by any means a comprehensive description of medical management, but just to give you a sense, it includes yearly whole body MRIs and brain MRIs, complete physical exams, which include, you know, skin exams and neurological examinations. And then later in life, people might get things like, you know, frequent colonoscopy screening and other things can start to be incorporated in that. So in this case, genetic testing of minors is indicated because, of course, the results can have a significant impact on medical management in children. So again, like I said, with Lynch syndrome, Li-Fraumeni syndrome is not the only child cancer syndrome that has childhood cancer risks, and medical management is just sort of one example of a few. But the reality is the majority of hereditary cancer syndromes are mostly adult cancer focused, I should say. You know, most of them are really only related to adult cancer risk. But again, circling back to the purpose of today's talk, which is not about who should or shouldn't be tested for hereditary cancer, but whether or not and how we can discuss this with our children. And really, it doesn't matter whether or not there's a syndrome that impacts them right now or won't impact them until adulthood. All of these things can, and I would argue, probably should be discussed with children when the time is right. And so let's talk about that a little bit more. So there's definitely been some studies looking at this idea of discussing hereditary cancer syndromes with children and looking at, you know, what some of the harms could be of not discussing versus what the actual benefits are of discussing and disclosing. Parents always worry about our children. I think our instincts are to protect them. And sometimes, you know, in doing that, we don't always make the right decisions about this kind of stuff. I think when it comes to harms of not discussing or disclosing, if you for example, as a parent, find out that you have a hereditary cancer predisposition syndrome, keeping it quiet and, you know, kind of not discussing it at all with children can actually increase your own anxiety and worry over time. So that can impact your own kind of psychological well-being. And then kids tend to hear and pick up stuff, even, as you know, even when we don't think that they are. And so this can lead to just them picking up bits and pieces of things, misunderstanding what's going on, confusion, or even self-blame, fearing that the worst could happen, in some cases losing trust in parents, being angry or resentful, frustrated, and it can actually weaken family cohesion. And so it's actually generally recommended that we think about a time and place to actually discuss and disclose, because what it does is it reduces both parental and child anxiety. It can actually empower children to become autonomous and take care of their own health needs, developing tools to do that, even if things won't impact them now, but may in the future, can help them sort of develop those tools for preparing for the future, can enhance coping strategies, emotional well-being, adaptation and self-identity, increasing understanding of family medical needs, and actually increases family cohesion. And so I thought this quote from one of the studies that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes was really striking, which is when children are not informed about the events taking place in the family, they often imagine a reality that is more dire than the truth. And I think for those of us who do have kids, I bet we've all experienced that in some form. So I wanted to then talk to you a little bit about a model for parents that was developed by Werner, Lynn, Merrill, and Brandt in this that they wrote up in a paper that was published in 2018 that is basically helping to think about how to disclose hereditary cancer to our children. And it has like basically 5 basic steps. So the first one is a really, really important step, which is that we can't help our kids or help anyone else until we kind of, I guess, to use kind of a cliche, put our own oxygen mask on first, which means we have to take care of ourselves first. So if this is something that you recently learned about, or you're having trouble adjusting to, and it's just causing a lot of stress, it's really important to give yourself time to adapt and adjust to the information, whether that means seeking out friends, family, or even professional support. And if you have a genetic counselor, they can often help you think about, some of this and help you work through some of it. A genetic counselor also is going to be helpful if you're, the other thing to get comfortable with is just understanding the basics, the science piece of it, right? So if you're thinking about talking to your kids, I mean, it depends a little on the ages of the kids, we'll get to that, but like being comfortable with just the real basics of how it's inherited or passed down, what testing entails, and what, what it could mean for you or other family members as far as medical management and things like that. And so once you've given yourself some time to do that, and that may be an ongoing process and have its own ups and downs, you can start to make a plan for who, when, and where you're going to disclose. Studies have shown that it can be best as far as the who to talk to all this, like if we're talking about your children, you have more than one child, talking to all of them at the same time, even though you may think, well, that child may not be impacted by this syndrome at all. Sometimes people think because of gender, there may not, depending on the syndrome or depending on the situation, someone should or shouldn't be included in the conversation. But it can be really, I think, helpful to actually have a conversation with whether it's all of them at the same time or just that you talk to each of them kind of generally around the same time. It helps to prevent feelings of inferiority or resentment with sibs and or distrust of the parents if you're kind of talking to one but not the others. As far as the when, I mean, that's going to, depend on a lot of things. Depends on the age, what they're ready to hear. Some people, will say critical life junctures are a good time to do it. Like if someone was diagnosed with cancer, they have to start screening because of a syndrome. I would argue that it would be probably even better to ideally even do it before then if possible. The timing of it, it's not a one-shot thing. It's always going to be developing over time as information, as kids get older, as they start to ask more questions, as it becomes more relevant, or kids may be learning about genetics or health in school and it kind of comes up naturally. Again, just to get back to the questions, that's really important. Child asks questions, really important to be guided by that. And it's just going to be ongoing. Good times to talk. I mean, you probably know the best times to talk. You can do family meetings. A lot of times with teenagers, car rides are a good time. You're not necessarily looking straight at them, or even going on walks where you're not necessarily looking straight at each other, or you're doing something else at the same time, which could make it a little bit easier to open up about this stuff. And so we talked about step 1, step 2, and basically step 3 about really letting the child guide the conversation, going based on what questions your child actually asks, which, by the way, sometimes we worry so much about them asking something we're not ready to talk about that we forget to just answer what they're asking. Sometimes, and I can tell you this with patients too, it happens, but sometimes someone is asking about how genetic testing works. And instead of, you might worry you have to tell them all the technical stuff about what's going on at the lab, but really they just want to know, do I need a needle stick for this test? Am I going to get stuck, or can I just kind of spit in a container? So really important to listen to that. Allow space for your child's reaction, just like you allowed yourself space, right? In step 1 of giving your child time to process, check in how they're doing, and then just, continuing to emphasize things being open, being honest, and having the dialogue be ongoing and kind of evolve over time. So some tips. Draw from previous experiences with your children. What have you done when there's been other difficult or stressful conversations with them that you think went well about those? You know your children best, and you know how you communicate with them best. I've said this already, but let their questions and reactions guide you, determine what they already know and what they really need to know, and go based on that. And then I'm not getting into this in great detail in this talk, but there's all sorts of literature about what kids of specific age brackets are kind of how they're able to learn. But I think the general, idea is obviously for the really young children, kids that are maybe between the ages of like 3 and 6. Picture books can be really, really important. And there's actually a lot of books out there. These are just a few of them. Some of them are geared toward, specific hereditary cancer syndromes. For example, Robot Music was published fairly recently, and that's a book about kids who have Li-Fraumeni syndrome who might be going in and getting lots of MRIs and screening. And then there's books for other syndromes for kids. The book Mom's Genes is more about just teaching kids about family history and what that means. And then Why is Mommy Having Surgery? That one is for talking about BRCA1 and 2 with kids, or hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. So there's a lot of, those are just a few. There's a lot of resources out there that are starting to be developed about this stuff specific to certain syndromes even. So a couple more tips. Normalizing can be really, really important. So I think if, if you need to go in for colonoscopy screening, or maybe breast cancer screening or something like that, and your child is noticing that you're doing this and it's different from before, you can compare it to other people. Maybe there's someone else in the family that has started doing this as well, especially, obviously if they're doing well with all of it. You can kind of relate, like, remember, this is kind of like what grandpa did or what grandmother did, that sort of thing. I think, even when things seem really scary or upsetting to us, there's almost always a way of just, it's not that you're glossing over, but I think you can frame things in a relatively positive way so as not to create a lot of fear in kids. Like I like to talk to kids about just, we're doing all this to keep us healthy, right? This is, and as a genetic counselor, that's why we even do and offer hereditary cancer testing, is because if we know that this is in the family, then we can do something about it to keep us healthy, to keep us from getting cancer or to find cancer early. So that can be a really positive way to frame it. Take your time, know it's going to evolve over time. Like I said, you might have to re-explain things. In some cases, if your child actually has a cancer syndrome like Li-Fraumeni that involves childhood cancer risks and they have to go into the doctor a lot, you might work with their medical providers and talk about what words you've used with them to explain this, and can they kind of use the same kinds of words, and you can kind of work as a team with them. So those are just some additional tips. And so I guess the takeaway message is that there really are ways to talk about hereditary cancer with children of all ages and stages in different ways. There's no one right way or time. You know your child best, and so trust yourself in that process. Be sure to provide information and emotional support at the developmental age and level of your child, and then keep the conversations open, honest, and ongoing. So it's just some of the references that we used for this talk, and just wanted to give a couple thank yous to Jackie Shenda, who was a colleague and friend of mine from when I worked at Dana-Farber, who some of these slides are adapted from her slide deck. And Stephanie Hicks, who is one of my current colleagues who helped me think about how to put this talk together. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carly. We are now at the end of the session, so if you have any questions for Carly, feel free to enter them in the chat box. We have a question about having a conversation with all siblings. What if my child is very young, like for an example, a 3-year-old? Can I talk to just one of my children with a syndrome in my family, or should I still include them in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to get back to like trust yourself of like, your children best and what's worked for you before. But a 3-year-old is so young. You may be able to wait a little bit on that if your other kids are older and they're more likely to talk about the stuff and pick up on it. I guess I just wouldn't wait too long. I wouldn't recommend letting that 3-year-old then become 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and like their older siblings are now teenagers and are talking about this, and that child now picks up on it. So I just wouldn't let it go for too long, I guess, would be my advice and when you think it's time to kind of have a little bit of a conversation about it, or just plant that seed, you can kind of go from there. It doesn't have to be a huge, obviously detailed conversation, especially with young kids, but probably good to loop them in at some point, not too far off.
Do you have any talking tips for families with younger children that are like around 3 years old? What level of information they should be providing? Yeah,
I think that hopefully you'll have access to the slides. I would definitely recommend using a picture book for kids that young to talk about this stuff. And like I said, those are only a few of the many that are out there. I personally, I have 4 kids that are a range of ages. And although I don't have a hereditary cancer syndrome in my family, I know that, just kind of, I guess, focusing on doing things to keep people healthy and things that we can have in common in our families. You know, like, you know, when you're thinking about, I don't know if this answers your question, but like, you know, why we look a little bit like our parents, you know, there's things in common in our families. You can frame it like that. But I would say for the most part, young kids, I mean, only answer what they're asking and pay attention, because they're probably not asking you anything that's too involved. And they may be satisfied with something really, really, really basic. And again, using some picture books, you know, little diagrams and stuff can be helpful.
Thank you. If the syndrome in my family won't impact my child until adulthood, can I just wait until then to talk about it?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier in the talk, is I don't think it's a great idea to do that, and the literature supports that. It's probably better, since, you know, I assume this is like a relatively significant thing for you, that it's something that you find the right time and place to begin having that conversation with them, so that what, you know, they can start to like adjust to the information, they can sort of absorb it over time. And then, you know, when they get to the time when it might be relevant to them from a medical perspective, and they can make decisions on their own about testing, they'll be that much more just informed and prepared, like more than probably you were, assuming this was, you know, kind of new for you. So I can't tell anyone how to parent their children. I'm not a parenting expert, but I do think that it's, in the literature supports, it's probably better to start those conversations earlier, even when it's not relevant to them yet.
Thank you. How can I tell my kids about the syndrome in the family without making them super worried or anxious? Is there a way, do you have any talking tips on framing it in a positive way?
I think there's almost always positive ways to frame things. You know, why did you have, I'm assuming it's you, but I don't know, it could be someone else that you're close to, but why did you or your relative, you know, get the genetic testing and find out about this syndrome in the family? Was it just to be worried? Probably not, right? If that was the case, I wouldn't have a job I was very proud of. But, you know, I think most people think, even though it can be hard to find out about these syndromes, at the end of the day, the positive is that we know this because now we're empowered with information that we can use and work with our doctors to help us stay healthy, right? We have information that can be really important for me and for you and for other people, so we can do the right things that we need to keep us healthy and cancer free, or, you know, finding cancer very early before anyone gets sick. So I guess that would be one tip. I think there's almost always positive ways to frame these things. I think if you're feeling really negative about it, that's something to think about. I think that goes back to, like, it's probably better if you're in a relatively good place with, it's okay to be upset and to tell your kids, I'm feeling sad about this right now. Don't get me wrong. I believe that's part of open and honest dialogue. But I think it's also important for you to fully believe that there is a positive aspect of this before you're able to convey that to your kids. They probably won't believe it if you don't believe it, if that makes sense.
For families who have difficulties having these conversations, do you find, like, is there any benefit to any group or family therapy? Could that help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I think that could be really helpful. I think, you know, one place to start would be, if you have a genetic counselor, you could certainly ask your genetic counselor about that as a starting point, and then she or he might have some insight as to, like, some tips on how to discuss it as a family that you could start with. And if not, perhaps making a referral to somebody, or just making, you know, or endorsing that idea of talking to someone. Your genetic counselor can, you know, we're not ongoing therapists, so we're a little bit more limited in that kind of stuff and don't have that kind of training. But with that said, let's say you found a family therapist who doesn't know anything about the syndrome. Well, they can work with us. We can give them information about the syndrome so you don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel and have the burden of explaining the whole thing to your mental health provider that's working with your family, if that makes sense. So think about coming back to your genetic counselor, finding someone in the community, and like putting everyone together so we can work as a team to support your family.
Thank you. Okay, so while we wait to see if there are any questions that come in, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience, Carly?
No, I mean, I guess my only thoughts are just as a parent myself of like, I think it's just important to trust yourself in this stuff, and always take care of yourself as best as you can first before having these conversations. And it's okay to make mistakes. You know, like you might have a conversation that you felt didn't go that well. And it's okay to go back and try again. You know, I say, I don't think I explained that very well, or I was really upset that day. That's fine. As you know, this whole business of being a parent or having a relationship with children is very, very imperfect and messy. So I would just say, like, be gentle on yourself, take care of yourself, and trust yourself.
Thank you. So I don't see any further questions, so I think we can end a few minutes early. As I had mentioned, the session today is being recorded, so if you're interested in viewing the recording, feel free to visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. And I know Carly had shared, the last slide with references as well as some suggestions for some book titles. If you'd like, you can also email the Blum Center and we'd be happy to share that with you. It's pflc@partners.org, and I can also type that in chat box. So feel free to email us and we'd be happy to share those resources with you as well. All right, Carly, thank you so much for today's session. It's very helpful. Everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.